Come on in, Bob.
I'll make it animated. Well, not everybody's going to Fiesta today, I'm happy to see, at least not quite yet. A few people want to work in the garden, and what a gorgeous day it is. From summer one day to nice spring-like weather the next, and so many fun things to do. And today's topic is, of course, perennials. And the one thing that I always like to start off saying when we talk about perennials is that they are not the only flowers to have in your garden. Everybody says, well, why should I even plant annuals when I can plant perennials that come back year after year after year? And perennials are great. They give you a lot of color over a long period of time. But unfortunately, perennials are pretty much exclusively warm weather things. We have very few perennials that are going to be in bloom in the middle of the winter. So as you plan your perennial beds, always save a little bit of room for annuals. Always save a little bit of room for snapdragons and pansies and fun things so that you can have color in the middle of the winter. And also about perennials, they are not totally maintenance free. You do have to get out and do some deadheading. You do have to get out and cut them back periodically. You do have to dig them and divide them. So the things that perennials aren't is they aren't color all the time, and they aren't something you just plant and forget about if you want to keep them, at their very maximum state of beauty. But the good things about them is that they really are dependable. If there's a year when you just don't have time to get out and plant a whole lot or do a lot of things, for the most part, they will come back and be there for you. And I guess the main things to tell you about growing perennials before we talk about just a handful of any varieties that are out there is, number one, be sure to understand how big they grow before you plant them. Again, one of the beauties of annuals is when you plant them, they're pretty much going to be dead in 6 months. And if you make a mistake and put them in the wrong place, it's no big deal because you're going to replace them the next season. But if you forget that this beautiful little plant in this 1-gallon container, if you forget that this thing is going to grow 15 feet tall and 6 feet wide, you're going to be in trouble. So always be sure with perennials that you understand the size that they are going to grow to. Second thing, always be sure you understand whether or not they need shade or they need sun. Because we have a wonderful collection of perennials these days to grow in shade as well as in sun, but don't get them mixed up. Because again, you're going to plant these things, and if you put them in the right place the first time around, it's a whole lot easier. So be sure and understand what the sun or shade needs are. And sometimes they can be, kind of misleading. You look at a plant like this agapanthus right here, and it looks pretty delicate, right? So you go and plant it in the shade, and then you call me and say, why did my agapanthus bloom? It's because you didn't put it out in full sun where it really wanted to be. And as delicate as that plant looks, probably the most striking group of agapanthus I've ever seen in my life, at least in San Antonio. There's some of them down the boulevards in San Francisco that are pretty spectacular. But old veterinarian friend Tom Weiss lives on top of a hill over off Callahan and I-10. And you look out the back of his house, he's got a pool, and then he's got this bed behind, and then it drops off to a view of the city. Blazing hot sun all day long, and probably the most beautiful bed of agapanthus in town. So they may look delicate, but they take a whole lot of sun. On the other hand, there are different plants that look, pretty tough and hardy, and yet will do extremely well in shady areas. So be sure that you understand how much shade or how much sun and put them in the right place first time around. Other thing is that with perennials, eventually, some of them at least, get big enough that they need to be divided and replanted. In general, there's a pretty easy rule to remember when you dig and divide different types of perennials. And that might be something like the agapanthus, might be something like iris, might be something like the cannas, which are right around to the side there. But always remember, the time that you divide perennials is opposite their bloom season. If they bloom in the spring, divide them and transplant them in the fall. If they bloom in the fall, divide them and transplant them in the spring. And it's as simple as that. It's pretty easy to keep up with. But obviously you're not digging and reworking the bed every time as you are with annuals, so you want to prepare the soil properly first time around. That generally means lots of compost if you need to loosen and improve the soil. As far as fertilizer, I tend to use a good old Medina granular. I'll put a bunch of it in the ground before I plant, and then follow up with applications every 6 or 8 weeks. And for flowering things, I like to use the Medina granular, even though we say that it is, of course, for trees and shrubs and grass and things like that. I like to use it at least 1 out of 3 times. Now, our Color Essentials fertilizer that works so well to make things bloom is a great fertilizer. But what we tend to do to get the very best results in the beds, and our beds are coming along out in the parking lot, some of them are starting to look pretty good. We will use like the Medina one time and then use the Color Essentials twice. And we'll use the Medina again, then use the Color Essentials twice. I like the Medina because it has extra iron in it, and I like it because it has a little bit more nitrogen in it than the Color Essentials. So that's sort of the balance that we do on fertilizing to keep things happy and growing. Most, yes ma'am?
When you say you put a bunch of it in when you're going to plant your original plant, what do you mean by a bunch?
A bunch. That's a pretty technical term. I would say
I'm afraid I'm going to put too much.
with organics, it's almost impossible to use too much. It may hurt in the bank account, but it usually won't hurt the plant. On planting a 1-gallon plant, I'll probably use a cup of fertilizer on something that size. But if you get a little bit too much, you get a little bit too little, that's the beauty of organics. It's not going to hurt anything.
Just want to put enough, but
Yeah.
overdo.
If in doubt, put a little extra. Because again, organics do not burn, and believe me, in our lousy soils, the plants really need the extra nutrition. Now, one other thing before I keep saying one other thing, I'm as bad as all those callers that say, I have just one more question. And 4 questions later, they finally gotten to the end of the list. But I keep thinking of a couple other things I want to tell you. Watch your plants for insect infestation, and don't panic if you see some insects on some of them. And I'm going to use this plant as an example. Most perennials have almost no problems with insects or things, but you may think they do. Now, this plant is a so-called butterfly weed or Asclepias, and if you plant this plant, I can almost promise you're going to get aphids. And that's a good thing, because the aphids, number one, don't ever really seem to cause much damage to this plant. Number two, the aphids don't ever, once they get on this plant, they don't ever seem to go anywhere else. And when, you can come in here, sir, we got plenty of room. And once you get the aphids on this plant, the beneficial insects really start moving in. If any of y'all, how many of y'all have grown butterfly weed before? Okay, and you know that if you put this plant out, you're going to get the little aphids up and down the stem. And if you watch carefully, you're going to see pretty soon you've got lacewing larvae on there, you've got ladybugs and ladybug larvae, you've got assassin bugs. And this is one of those plants that is great. Come on in.
Sorry.
Great for for getting beneficial insects into the garden. And every year we always get lots of questions. You know, I want to plant these plants that attract beneficials. Well, that all sounds well and good, but the truth is, plants don't attract beneficial insects. There's no plant out there that has anything that a beneficial insect wants. A beneficial insect eats bad guys, eats other insects. They don't eat plants. They're carnivores. They're not vegetarians. So when we plant a plant that we say attracts beneficial insects, the way it attracts beneficial insects is by first attracting things like aphids, which then come in to eat the beneficial insects. So if you see something like aphids on this plant, don't worry, it's supposed to have aphids, and it's doing you a favor because it's bringing all those good guys in that are then going to go after, you know, the bad things that may get on other plants. So not to worry if you see a few aphids on things like this.
What was that plant? Butterfly.
This plant is called, common name is butterfly weed. Now don't get it confused with butterfly bush or butterfly vine. Again, a little problem with common names. This is butterfly weed. This is the form that has orange and yellow flowers on it. There's another form of it called silky gold that has pure yellow flowers on it. Outstanding plant. And we'll talk about that along with a bunch of others. I'm sorry?
How big is it?
About like so.
So you could keep it in a pot.
You can keep it in a big pot if you like. And it makes seed pods. It's also, don't worry if you see caterpillars on this plant, because it's one of the host plants for the larva of the monarch butterfly. So again, we got to get away from this ortho